the story of American Antifa over the last 10 years is a bit of a Cassandra story, in so much as they saw what was coming down the pipeline. They saw, because they were paying such close attention, they saw how what most of us would describe as kind of the fringe far right actually wasn't that fringe at all. That the fascist groups and what they were saying had very close ties to the Republican Party and to the MAGA movement, and that all the energy in American conservatism was for an outright fascism. And so I think they kind of made the argument before anyone else that America was on this really dark path. And I think we're kind of in the moment that Antifa predicted.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this journey. My guest today is Christopher Mathias. He's the author of the new book, To Catch a Fascist, The Fight to Expose the Radical Right. Chris, it's a fascinating book. It's insightful. It's so well written.
Thank you.
I'm a fan.
Oh, I'm so glad, man. That means a lot coming from you.
Well, all of us who venture into this world of hate and political extremism, we have our entry points.
Mm-hmm.
Your entry point was Charlottesville in 2017, the event where Heather Heyer was killed. What was it about Charlottesville that set you on this journey?
Yeah, sure. So at the time I was a reporter at HuffPost, and up until that point, I'd covered a lot of criminal justice, and I'd covered a lot of Islamophobia, and Islamophobia kind of, I think segued kind of naturally into me covering the broader far right. And, me and my reporting partner at the time, Andy Campbell, arrived in Charlottesville. And I think as much as we've been writing about the far right, by that point, I think we were still a little green. And, for people that may not remember, Charlottesville was the largest white supremacist gathering in a generation. And I think we often forget the degree to which Trump's rise to the White House in 2016 corresponded with this explosion in like a new generation of masked, secretive white supremacist groups. Kind of like this, as if there were a lot of people trying to resurrect the Ku Klux Klan's invisible empire for the digital age. It was all these people online hiding behind usernames and avatars and other disguises to kind of start spreading this new iteration of fascism. And, the violence in Charlottesville was remarkable. Andy and I covered what was essentially pitched battles in the streets for 2 hours. And then I was in the parking garage where a group of neo-Nazis beat a black counter-protester named DeAndre Harris. I ran after DeAndre when the beating was happening, and then someone pointed a gun, so I ducked. And, later, not long after that, I interviewed a woman who had just survived and witnessed the car attack when James Alex Fields, a neo-Nazi, drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters and killed 32-year-old Heather Heyer. And I think what was so shocking about Charlottesville was not only the size and scope of the demonstration and the way that, we hadn't seen a gathering of that size in so long, but also how emboldened they were. And the reason they were emboldened was because they had a partner, they thought, in the White House. They very much thought that they were responsible for getting Trump elected to the White House. They thought their propaganda had, propelled him there, that they had memed him into the White House. So it was a celebration, and I think it's kind of underappreciated the degree to which it was a Trump rally.
Yeah, and I was really struck in reading your introduction
Yeah.
that, and I think I knew this, but maybe had forgotten it, but you noted that anti-fascist researchers had actually warned the authorities
Right.
that there were people in the Unite the Right rally who were talking about, driving through crowds of counter-protesters.
Yeah. No, it's crazy to realize, and this was actually something I didn't realize myself when I was in Charlottesville. But, there was, and we'll get into this a little later, but, anti-fascist activists often work as spies. They deploy espionage. And in the lead up to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, a spy was in the planning server for the rally, which, involved kind of a coalition of different types of white supremacist groups. And this spy lingered in those chats for months and collected just mountains of evidence of the kind of the murderous intent of this rally. Like the stated purpose of the rally was to defend a statue of Robert E. Lee, which was slated to be toppled in a park in Charlottesville. That was just a ruse. It was just a pretext to kind of hold this giant demonstration. And when you pour through those, the documents that they obtained, it's, I've been covering the far right for 10 years now, and going through those documents, I found myself shocked at how vile it was and how kind of explicit their intent to commit violence was. And, we can get into this a little later, but what the spy uncovered was given to local officials, and activists pleaded with the local officials to revoke the permit, basically saying, like, people are going to die. And of course, people did. Not only Heather Heyer, but, incidentally, a police helicopter crashed at the end of the day, and 2 police officers died. But, a year later, the mayor of Charlottesville actually apologized to some local activists for not listening to them.
Yeah, for this book, you talked to about 60 anti-fascist activists. Quickly summarize for me, what is Antifa?
Mm-hmm.
What does the right get wrong about Antifa? And also, what does the left get wrong about Antifa?
Sure. Yeah. So Antifa is obviously just a shortening of the word anti-fascist. And I think most Americans, most of the people watching us talk right now, I would hope, would consider themselves anti-fascist. But Antifa itself actually refers to a specific kind of militant style of politics, or a specific tradition of combating the far right. And in America, it has its origins in kind of the punk scene. In the 80s and 90s, there was a movement among punks who most often identified as anarchists and socialists and communists. And these were young people. And incidentally, this started in Minneapolis with a group called the Balties. It's a multiracial crew of young punks that were tired of seeing Nazis encroach on their turf, of like coming to punk shows and committing violence. So they started to punch Nazis and get them off the streets. And then they started to develop a lot of other tactics too. And by the mid-90s, they developed some specific tenets of what would become kind of Antifa or militant anti-fascism. And those basic tenets, the first idea is, we go where they go. It's essentially like, we will monitor and follow fascists wherever they go. And sometimes they need to be confronted, and confronted violently. And that means, sometimes we're going to punch you. The second tenet is that fascists should be given no platform to speak or organize. So that means you're trying to get their permits revoked for rallies. It means you, kind of in the modern era, you are trying to get them deplatformed from social media for violating terms of service. The third kind of big tenet is that the state and law enforcement cannot be trusted in this fight. So Antifa, as we know it, will not work with law enforcement, will not partner with law enforcement, does not trust local elected officials for the most part to be a part of this fight. They see militant anti-fascism as a project that belongs to the people, and it's kind of like an organic grassroots phenomenon. In its modern iteration, Antifa is just kind of a fundamentally an underground subculture and network that for the last 10 years, is best known, I think, for viral videos of its practitioners punching people. But what my book gets into, and the argument it makes, is that what it was actually doing was research and espionage that ultimately unmasked thousands of previously pseudonymous white supremacists, and actually ended up destroying a few kind of alt-right or fascist groups.
Well, and let me ask you, President Trump has declared Antifa to be a domestic terrorist organization. The executive order begins with, Antifa is a militarist, anarchist enterprise that explicitly calls for the overthrow of the United States government, law enforcement authorities, and our system of law. It uses illegal means to organize and execute a campaign of violence and terrorism nationwide to accomplish these goals. Is that right?
So yes and no. I mean, basically, to call Antifa terroristic is absurd. This executive order that Trump claimed to make is kind of absurd on its face, but it is also dangerous. So there is no federal statute by which to designate any domestic group a terrorist organization. And I think that's a good thing, right? Because like even, you know, if we wanted to, you know, it might be a good thing, right? Like, because it can lead to a slippery slope situation where if someone's in power that designates, for example, the Klan a terrorist group, when someone else comes in power, they're going to designate, you know, the opposite side of the political spectrum as terrorists. It can be an avenue to go after your political opponents. And that is what Trump is trying to do. There is no federal statute for this, but he's making the designation anyway. And what he's doing that for is, I think, to kind of signal to law enforcement and to vigilantes across the country that it's open season on the left. And, you know, very quickly, like to kind of bring home the point that it's absurd to call Antifa terrorist. Yes, Antifa has punched people in the streets. There's been viral videos of it. In 2020, there was one murder where a Michael Renault in Portland, Oregon, got into a confrontation with a Proud Boy. He argued it was in self-defense, and then, well, the Proud Boy, I believe, had a can of bear mace. Some other things happened, and Michael Renault claimed it was self-defense. He fired and killed this far-right activist. He, incidentally, was later killed by federal agents while on the run in what some reporting has suggested might have been an extrajudicial execution. But, you know, prior to that, Antifa couldn't really be tied to any murders over the previous few decades. The far right, however, could be connected to hundreds and hundreds of murders. So I would argue that this kind of domestic terror claim is absurd on its face. And also, when you kind of unpack the language of domestic terrorism, what the Trump administration is trying to do is create the pretext for doing whatever it wants to whomever it deems domestic terrorist. What did they say about Renee Good and Alex Preddy after they were murdered in Minneapolis? The Trump administration called them domestic terrorists as kind of a way of retroactively justifying their deaths. And I think that is kind of what's at play here with the terror designation. And, you know, my book gets into this, but MAGA, the wider right, the GOP, Trump, they have a very expansive definition of who constitutes Antifa, and they will use that label against anyone that is opposed to their agenda.
Now, on the flip side, what does the left get wrong about Antifa?
Sure. So maybe less a little bit the left than like kind of liberals and centrists, and but there is kind of this pervasive idea that or claim that Antifa doesn't really exist. So, you know, they latch onto the fact that Antifa is a shortening of the term anti-fascist, and they will say that, well, it's just an idea, you know. There's no headquarters, there's no leaders, which is all true. Like Antifa as a network is decentralized. There are no leaders. It's non-hierarchical. It's an anarchist thing, and anyone can do it. But, you know, the kind of liberal centrist response is, I would argue, and I wrote a piece in The Nation about this, is, you know, they kind of treat the idea of Antifa with snark and incuriosity. And, you know, I think whenever Trump talks about Antifa in kind of hysterical terms, which we can get into in a bit, you know, the left's response will be to, and including politicians, they'll make jokes like, is Antifa in the room with you right now, and stuff like that.
So what I hear you saying, Antifa is real. It's
Yes.
just not what some on the right would like to make it out to be.
Exactly. And so for the last 10 years, the right has worked very hard to manufacture so many misapprehensions and misconceptions about what Antifa is. You know, quick history of this. After Charlottesville, the right is on the defensive. They know that what happened in Charlottesville is a really bad look for them, that there are, honest to God, Nazis and fascists in their coalition, and that they just murdered someone in Charlottesville, and that they committed all this kind of live streamed violence that the whole world saw. So there's this pseudonymous pro-Trump troll named Microchip who starts a viral petition to the Trump White House at the time to, as we were just talking about, designate Antifa a domestic terror group. Antifa, incidentally, by the way, no one in America knew what Antifa was before 2017. You know, everyone's trying to figure out what it is. And Microchip makes this petition And then he gives an interview to Politico that is like almost refreshingly honest and frank about the purpose of this petition. He says, he concedes that he knows that the Trump administration can't actually designate Antifa a terror group. There's no law for that. That's not the point of this petition, which about 500,000 people sign. The point of the petition is to set up Antifa as a punching bag. It is to distract and deflect from the right's very real violence and to create a false equivalency between the right and the left. It's to say, it's kind of this extreme form of whataboutism. It says, yes, the right is committing violence, but look, you guys are committing it too. It's like kind of this almost childish way of being like, yeah, but they started it. And, Microchip does this, and after that, all these other MAGA and right-wing influencers follow suit. And over the next couple years, after every mass shooting, every natural disaster, these MAGA influencers rush into the kind of immediate information vacuum, like when we didn't really know who the shooters were or who was responsible for what, and they would blame it on Antifa. They would spread these conspiracy theories. So Antifa was started to get blamed for everything. I think and there was also just so many viral rumors. One of the funniest rumors is, there's a left-wing account on Twitter that decided to kind of parody this hysteria about Antifa and tweeted something along the lines of, I'm getting reports that Antifa super soldiers are going to behead white parents on November 11th or something. The Gateway Pundit, which, is a kind of widely read MAGA right-wing blog or website.
Not the most credible.
Absolutely not the most credible, but nevertheless widely read. It takes this tweet as real, as factual, and publishes an article, which incidentally is the name of one of the chapters of my book, Antifa Super Soldiers. But at any rate, a few years later in 2020, during the George Floyd uprisings, this kind of Antifa boogeyman is resuscitated once again, but kind of for a different reason. The George Floyd uprisings are kind of one of the biggest demonstrations in American history, at least in a generation, millions of people taking to the streets. The way the Antifa boogeyman is utilized by MAGA at this point is they blame these demonstrations and these uprisings on Antifa. They say that Antifa is like fomenting them. Like Antifa provocateurs are the ones that are kind of starting all this. The purpose of a project like that is to kind of delegitimize these uprisings, to say that they were manufactured or astroturfed, that they were committed by outside agitators and didn't represent the communities in which they took place. That, of course,
which is what we're seeing in Minneapolis right now.
Absolutely, it's the same thing all over again, and that was always wrong. Those were organic grassroots uprisings, and this attempt to blame it on Antifa provocateurs was an attempt to distract from the very real grievance at the heart of those demonstrations, which was we want the state and law enforcement to stop killing Black people. Did Antifa take part in those demonstrations? Yeah, of course. But Antifa is an incredibly small subculture and network, and they would not have the power to propel or make demonstrations like that. And then, the final kind of iteration of the Antifa boogeyman we're living under now, which, after Charlie Kirk is assassinated, Trump makes his Antifa terror designation. There is a kind of a farcical Antifa round table at the White House, during which Jack Posobiec and Andy Ngo and kind of other kind of far-right MAGA influencers give testimony. And actually something that comes of that is, I believe it's Andy Ngo at one point suggests to Donald Trump that Antifa be designated a foreign terror organization. And, there's a very real, clear reason why that suggestion is made. That way, if you find Americans who have donated any money to an anti-fascist organization or group overseas, then you can charge them at home for material support of a terrorist organization. It kind of is an end run around the fact that there are no federal statutes to charge someone with domestic terrorism. So this suggestion is made at the round table, I believe by Andy Ngo, and we should fact check that. within a month, Marco Rubio announces that 5 groups in Europe are designated terror groups. And these are all very small groups, with some of which have no real connection to American anti-fascist groups, but, it's nevertheless made. So you can see the Trump administration is determined to keep this Antifa boogeyman alive and see what it can get out of it.
Yeah, and let me do devil's advocate for a moment. You have a very compelling character that is in the first part of your book, a person named Vincent.
Yes.
Vincent infiltrates Patriot Front, which is a white nationalist group, the group that plasters a lot of its logos all over the place and its propaganda. It's known for these flash mob type protests. They typically wear white gaiters around their faces.
Mhm.
And it's a compelling story about, it's kind of an edge of your seat type of story with him. But when he leaves Patriot Front, Antifa engages in a vandalism of Patriot Front vehicles.
Yes.
Smashing windows, painting, the outside of vehicles, smashing the vehicles themselves. I think some people will look at that and say, that's just the flip side. It's the opposite side of the same coin
hmm
of as to what the far right does. What's your take on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I'll put it this way. I think the idea that it's the flip side kind of suggests that there's kind of a golden center in politics. And I think that's maybe not the framing that like anti-fascists use. They don't, uh, their violence, and there's a really interesting academic scholar named Nigel Copsey in the UK who did a very big report called 21st Century Militant Anti-Fascism. And, his kind of argument when he researches the difference between left-wing and right-wing violence is that left-wing violence is kind of very deliberate and selective, and at least anti-fascist violence is, right? Like it's targeting these people who they see as an inherent kind of insurgent threat to their communities. Whereas far-right violence is not selective and more discriminate or indiscriminate, however you want to put it, where it's, targeting people based on their kind of status in marginalized groups. And also the kind of the scale of far-right violence is so much bigger. I think anti-fascist violence, kind of the, argument for it is that it is a counter violence, right? It is um, groups like Patriot Front, groups like that marched in Charlottesville are already committing violence, and we have to stop them. And we cannot trust law enforcement. We cannot trust the state to stop this. So we're going to take it into our own hands. And, in the case of the Patriot Front, a sabotage, they shatter Patriot Front's windshields, they slash their tires, they paint over the cars. But, at least in that instance, they actually didn't hurt anybody.
And I think it's also important to note this is a very small percentage of what Antifa does. I
Yes.
mean,
Yeah.
my experience dealing with people who would consider them to be themselves to be Antifa is largely their keyboard warriors. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of viral moments of Antifa militancy are really obscure the bulk of the work that Antifa does. And very quickly to go back to the violence, I remembered the way I kind of explained it in the book, which is that if you're in a bar and someone walks in throwing up a Sikh Heil and shouting racial slurs, most people in America, I would hope, would ask that person to leave. And for a good reason. That person poses a threat and is liable to commit violence against someone in that bar. If that person does that and refuses to leave the bar, then that person is probably going to be physically removed from that bar. There's going to be physical force involved in removing that person from the bar. And I think that dynamic is fine and justified. From the militant anti-fascist perspective, that dynamic of what's happening in that bar doesn't change just because Nazis are marching in the streets. They see Nazis as, whenever they march, whenever they organize in the streets, as an inherent threat because their ideology calls for the explicit murder of many of our neighbors and loved ones and family members. So, sorry, that's I think the kind of the anti-fascist approach. As for the degree that Antifa actually uses violence. I interviewed about 60 people for the book. I think only a handful have ever, done anything.
Punch a Nazi.
Punch a Nazi. Yeah. Most of what they were doing was research and intelligence gathering. I made
and they're very good at it.
They're fantastic at it, Phil. They, over the last 10 years, Antifa has exposed or unmasked thousands of previously unidentified white supremacists. And they do this in large part through open source investigations, right? So basically analyzing digital footprints of kind of anonymous accounts and figuring out who the real people are behind those accounts or kind of the members of secretive white supremacist groups. We talked about Vincent, who went undercover into Patriot Front. One of the most significant parts of his infiltration is that afterwards, anti-fascists suddenly have 440 gigabytes worth of internal messages that Patriot Front members send to themselves, including photos and videos. 440 gigabytes ends up on an open database on Unicorn Riot, which is an independent media collective, which does great work, by the way. And this kind of anti-fascist network of researchers across the country pours through those messages to find evidence and clues, little morsels that can be used to identify, to find the real identities of Patriot Front members in their communities. Ultimately, because of that infiltration, because of that, all that intelligence, this bounty of intelligence, some 80 members of Patriot Front are identified. There are similar stories where Identity Europa, which is one of the main white supremacist groups that was in Charlottesville, also suffers a breach by an anti-fascist spy. Its messages end up in this database. 100 of its members are unmasked, and Identity Europa ends up having to disband. But, the way, as for like the nitty gritty of how anti-fascists are doing this, it's really, I think, what you and I would recognize as journalism. It's just investigations. It's, finding little morsels, like if someone in a private chat mentions that what they do for a living, or if they post a photo, but forget to remove the metadata from that photo. You can see where that photo was taken. It's, I think, one of my favorite kind of data points I pulled is I made a spreadsheet of about 1,000 doxes over the last 10 years that anti-fascists published. 6 Nazis were unmasked because they posted photos of their dogs online. And basically anti-fascists would find the photo, see the photo of that dog, and then see if they could find a photo of that dog somewhere on social media, collect a lot of other corroborating evidence, and then publish a dox of a Nazi.
So is this doxing indiscriminate? I mean, for example, if some 18-year-old goes to a meeting, he's just curious, he's trying to find his way in life. Will Antifa dox that person?
It's so there's a informal code of ethics around who is liable to be doxed. If you're underage, you're probably not going to get doxed. Antifa typically doesn't do that. There was one incident in Colorado where they did, and that was because I believe that the guy was 17 years old and was making kind of escalating threats of committing real world violence. So they decided to publish it. That student, because of the severity of those threats, was asked not to walk at his high school graduation. Sometimes if the person is 18 years old, they will publish a dox. But like you mentioned, if a person has just gone to one meeting, Antifa will take that into account, I think, when considering whether it's okay. And, I think it's also worth noting here that Antifa is not going to dox people at a Trump rally for the most part. That's not who they're looking at, even though a lot of people at a Trump rally might have the same bigotries as people in a white supremacist group. For the most part, militant anti-fascist Antifa, they are looking at kind of the worst of the worst, the most explicit bigots, parts of members of groups that are committing real world violence, or members of groups that make really explicit calls for the creation of a white ethno-state, for the expulsion of everyone but white people from the United States. So they are, I would argue, very careful. They will often, when they are unmasking someone, be careful not to identify that person's family members. They will, if they're posting photos of the white supremacists that they have unmasked, they will blur out the faces of other people in that photo. As a running joke, they will also blur out the faces of dogs in that photo. Um, but yes, I think what you're asking is, they are very selective in how they go about it.
Has Antifa saved lives?
Mark Bray, who wrote a book about Antifa in 2017, kind of made a point about this, which is that, kind of one of the ironies of anti-fascist work is that you end up destroying a lot of fascist groups and before anyone ever hears about them. So in a way, it's kind of impossible to prove a negative, but I do think anti-fascist work has stopped a lot of fascist organizing in the streets. And as we've seen over the last 10 years, fascist organizing in the streets often leads to real world violence and death. I will say, at the end of, here's a quick story. After Charlottesville, one of the main organizers of Charlottesville was Richard Spencer, who was kind of the neo-Nazi poster boy at the time. Profiled in a lot of magazines and newspapers, and very prominent voice in this kind of new movement calling itself the alt-right. He's, by the way, best known for getting punched during Trump's inauguration. It was kind of a very big viral moment. But after Charlottesville...
And I think his group also had the gathering where they ended up doing Sig Heils at the inauguration.
Yes, no, yeah, exactly. There was like a hidden camera in there, and basically a lot of his supporters were throwing up the Nazi salutes, and Spencer said, hail Trump, hail victory, Sieg Heil is that's the English translation of that. At any rate, after Charlottesville, Spencer attempts to go on a campus speaking tour. But at every attempt in Gainesville, Florida, in Lansing, Michigan, in Auburn, Alabama, wherever he goes, his supporters are confronted in the streets and sometimes punched. I covered his rally in Lansing, Michigan, at the Michigan State University, where anti-fascists confronted a lot of the people there to support Spencer, and Spencer ended up speaking to a very tiny room of people. In Gainesville, Florida, similarly, his Nazi supporters were confronted in the streets. Someone I interviewed at that rally, an hour after I interviewed him, this was a supporter of Spencer's, his brother, and another white supremacist ended up opening fire on counter demonstrators and were arrested for attempted murder. Basically, over the course of the next few months, Spencer is so exhausted by anti-fascist efforts to stop his planned speaking tour that he cancels the tour and says in this live stream that, we need to come to terms with the fact that Antifa is going to confront us in the streets, not only online, and says Antifa is winning. And after that, Spencer cancels his speaking tour, and this kind of 2017, 2018 era where there's a lot of fascist organizing in the streets stops. So that's my very long-winded way of saying, yes, I think anti-fascist organizing has saved lives. I think it made open fascist organizing in the streets, which I would argue is inevitably going to end in violence against marginalized groups. It made it very untenable there for a while.
Your book has so much rich detail that we can't do justice to it here. Last question. You say in the introduction, it feels urgent to tell American Antifa story because in so many ways, Antifa was right. What was Antifa right about?
So yeah, thanks for asking about that. I think because Antifa was watching the far right so closely, and because they took the far right at their word, and because they saw the far right as kind of an inherent threat, it's kind of my argument in the story that my book tells, that the story of American Antifa over the last 10 years is a bit of a Cassandra story, in so much as they saw what was coming down the pipeline. They saw, because they were paying such close attention, they saw how what most of us would describe as kind of the fringe far right actually wasn't that fringe at all. That the fascist groups and what they were saying had very close ties to the Republican Party and to the MAGA movement, and that all the energy in American conservatism was for an outright kind of fascism. It was a kind of complete hostility towards democracy. And so I think they kind of made the argument before anyone else that America was on this really dark path. And I think we're kind of in the moment that Antifa predicted. And the reason I say it was Cassandra is because, Antifa was doing all this remarkable work, this kind of journalism, research, espionage, and yet like kind of the alarm they were raising, the 5 alarm, kind of saying that this is like a 5 alarm fire, are like mainstream news media and pundits often didn't listen to them, I think, and dismissed them as radicals or kind of just, extremists on the other end of the political spectrum. So the argument of my book makes is that, if Antifa was right, maybe we should consider why they were right and listen to their story a little bit.
It's a fascinating book. It's certainly timely. I'm certain people who read it will find lots to discuss and debate. The book again is "To Catch a Fascist: The Fight to Expose the Radical Right" by Christopher Mathias. Chris, thanks so much for your time.
Phil, I should say quickly, obviously I'm a huge admirer of yours, and so it's an honor to be on here, and I'm very stoked you're starting this Substack, and thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Good to talk with you.
You too.